Class. So I'm going to lecture through a little bit of chapter one for you so that you can take your quiz and just, get started going into the textbook. So give me a second to share my slides. Remove me. I don't know if you can still see me or not, but okay. Chapter one, the introduction to behavioral research. So y'all are all psych majors. You all know a whole lot about research already. And I honestly don't think there's anything in this textbook as a broad concept that you'll come across that you haven't heard before. But I hope that you'll see it in a new light and we'll dig deeper into it than you have and you'll be exposed to it more. But honestly, it's all pretty basic pieces of psychology that you know, right? Scientific method, empirical evidence, correlational studies, surveys, ethics and research, things like that. So I don't think anything's going to completely blow your mind and you'll be like, wow, I've never heard of that before. I've never thought about that. But hopefully we can get into those things a little bit deeper and that will help you understand stuff a little bit more. So first off, your book talks about why should you care about research if you don't want to do research in your career. A lot of people become psych majors because they want to help people, right? You want to move on from your bachelor's in psych to counseling or private practice or to be a social worker, maybe to do clinical practice as a psychologist or work in schools as an LSSP or whatever you want to do with your degree in psychology. I'm going to say that 98% of you in my class, maybe 99%, don't want to do research. And that's fair. I didn't think that I wanted to do research in the beginning either in undergrad. And then I got exposed to it and did it more in my master's. And it was really cool. But if you haven't been bit by the research bug yet, most of you are probably like, oh, I have to take this research class, even though I don't care about research. I'm never going to use research. I just want to help people. But learning about research can help you in your other classes and it provides you knowledge about everyday behaviors. It aids clinicians in their practices. So say you do just want to be a social worker or a counselor or whatever, right? So you have this client that comes in and they have this disorder and you want to help them. Well, what are you going to do? You're not going to make up a treatment that no one's ever heard of. You're going to go to the body of research. You're going to research what other researchers or clinicians have used, and you're going to try that with your client and go down the list. But you have to be able to read and interpret research to know what other people have done in the field. So when you have people, it should help address issues people encounter in a bunch of different areas. And since you're not reinventing the wheel, it allows you to go interpret that research and apply it to your patients or where you're at. So lastly, the basics can help people interpret reports and help you decide how to evaluate claims. Honestly, even at the supermarket, right? You're standing at the checkout line and there are all these magazines there and they say, do this weight loss thing or do this to get rich quick or I don't know, whatever the cover of the magazine says, right? Well, if you know how to interpret research, you can go to the back of the article, you can find their source, you could look up that source, and then you could see, well, what's your N of? You have an N of 10. So you asked 10 people and 10 people did that and it worked. That's not very convincing. Is your N more than 10? Is it more than 30? Did you ask 1,000 people? Where are your sources, right? What did you base this off of? But if you know research and you care about research, you can do that. The same is true for just advertisements, right? You're in the grocery store and you're trying to decide which diapers to buy. Maybe that's the era of life I'm in right now, right? And Pampers has this thing all over the box that says #1 pediatrician recommended brand. And I'm like, oh, well, if all the pediatricians always recommend Pampers, that's what I need for my baby. And then you flip it over and there's like an asterisk. And then you like research that and you actually look up what they're saying. It's something really specific that's something like out of all pediatricians asked about Pampers, 100% asked or recommended that. I don't know, it's ridiculous. And so it's not that 100% or most pediatricians recommend Pampers. It's a very niche way they worded it so that they could say that on the front of the box. And if you know research, you too cannot be fooled by large, broad stroke advertising claims. So let's do an exercise before we get started talking about the science and how we go about the scientific method and things we know. So, exercise first, write down 2 things you know. Pause the video, 2 things you know about anything. The sky's blue, the earth is round, pink's a great color, right? Just pause the video and write down 2 things that you know personally. Okay, I'm gonna take a drink of my water and assume that you pause the video. Okay, so you've written down 2 things that you know. Now I want you to write down how you know those things or think about how you know those things. So the earth is round. I know that because somebody told me that. I did not personally go out in a spaceship and get far enough away from the earth that I could see that the earth was round. Pink's a good color. Well, I know that because it's my favorite color. So of course I think pink's a great color. So I know those things because I just know that pink's a good color. So think about how you know those 2 things that you wrote down. And if you need to pause the video, pause it again. So the point of that, right, is that there are different types of knowledge. So your textbook starts out talking about observations, authority, deduction, intuition, those types of knowledge. And so everything falls into one of these 4 grids that you see on your screen. And it's either objective or subjective knowledge that we either have to accept or we can actually analyze. So for my 2, the Earth is round. Well, that's objective, right? We do know that that's true, but for me, it was acceptance, an authority figure, a textbook, a map. Someone had to tell me that, and that would live in the objective acceptance box because I haven't actually seen it. Subjective acceptance would be where my favorite color lives, right? Pink is a good color. Um, or I guess I could put it in analysis and I could try to persuade you that pink is the best color because of all these arguments that I could make about it, but it would still be subjective and it would not ever make it onto the objective side. So, for example, we have empiricism, experience, observation. Those things live in the objective analysis box. In the objective acceptance box, we have things like authority figures, right? Your textbook said it, your professor in class said it, instruction, regulation, rules, laws. They're objective and we all come to accept them, right? We drive on the right side of the road because we've all accepted that as a rule or a law. There's nothing like in nature making us do that, compelling us to do that, but we all as a society, at least in the United States, have agreed that that's what we're going to do. On the subjective side, in subjective analysis, we have rationalism, logical reasoning, deduction, persuasion. So think about deduction, right? You can deduce things about specifics because you know things about the whole. So if I know that all dogs typically have 4 legs and you tell me you have a dog, I'm just going to assume, I'm going to deduce that your dog also has 4 legs. And then tenacity, faith, intuition, those live in the subjective acceptance category. So, you know, you meet your friend's boyfriend and you just have a feeling, I just don't think that guy's a good guy. I don't think that guy's right for my friend. It's intuition. You can't, it's very subjective, right? And you've accepted that what you're saying is true and you hope that your friend will, but you can't analyze it. You can't tell your friend why. You can't give an objective reasoning. So things like that. It's just going to be a good day today. That's intuition. We can't really explain it away, but you just feel it. So those are the 4 different categories of knowledge that we have. So intuition is based on something, right? On previous knowledge. So maybe you knew a guy like that in high school and he kind of reminds you of him, or your dog barked at him and your dog never barks at anybody. And so based on your previous knowledge about your dog, you think, well, that guy's not going to be a great guy for my girl. Deduction is the act of using knowledge to make inferences, like my dog example. The authority is the source of information that's most likely accurate. They might not be accurate, and things change, right? Science is always changing. So if I showed you a psychology textbook from 50 years ago, some of the things that we accepted from authority as true 50 years ago are not true in psychology anymore, even as a hard science. Same for some other areas of research or just living. I mean, textbooks are not across the board, they're not peer reviewed, right? So when we tell you go find some peer reviewed research, textbooks are not that. Anyone could technically write a book and self publish it. So just because it's in your textbook doesn't mean that it's infallible, right? We trust them as an authority. We use textbooks for a reason. And you would hope that if someone got published by like Pearson or Cengage or McGraw-Hill, that they'd be really reputable, and usually they are. But I just want you to know that just because it's in a textbook doesn't mean that it's 100% accurate. And then the observation, that's the direct gathering of information. I really saw this thing happen, and I've gathered this information that I saw when I was observing with my own two eyes. So in the area of human behavior, animal behavior, right, behavioral research, it can help confirm that information's accurate. We can't prove facts, but we can support ideas with data. We, as research psychologists, will never go out to prove our theory, right? We will look for, honestly, the opposite. We look for support that our theory isn't true, that intervention isn't going to work, that this assessment won't help these people, right? We look for support for the null hypothesis. We look for support that what we're doing will not work. And then when we can't find any support that it won't work, then we can accept the alternative hypothesis, but we don't seek out information to prove our theory or our hypothesis. And then observation allows for a more objective way to gain knowledge. So when we're using science, the scientific method to understand and explain behavior, we like to infer this information that we've gathered through direct observation. And then once we've observed, we can choose the best treatment or therapy based on past research. And we know that biology can be analogous to psychology, right? They're similar. We know that it's not one or the other. Maybe 100 years ago in psychology, we wanted people to choose nature versus nurture, but we know now that it's both. We know that they work together. So when you think of scientific research and the scientific method, and we apply that to psychology, there's really four basic canons here. We have empiricism, determinism, parsimony, and testability. So empiricism is the assumption that observations yield the most accurate information. Your book talks about Galileo as an example, because up to that point in his lifetime in the world, people had just accepted, based on authority figures, that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then Galileo went out as an empiricist and observed the solar system and the way all the planets moved and stars and all the stuff that he did. And he said, no, guys, I kind of think the sun's the center of the universe and we're revolving around it, which was groundbreaking. Like, that's crazy. How dare he say something so ridiculous? But it's because he actually used observation and empiricism to go look for himself and was like, nah, I think the authority figures are wrong. Sun's definitely the center, not Earth. Observation provides more accurate understanding than other methods. So how could we use empiricism and observational experiments, right? We could use it in surveys. We could use it with basic tasks. And then a key piece of this is that it has to be replicable. If we cannot replicate what we've seen, then we don't know that what we saw wasn't due to chance. Maybe the difference that we saw in test scores from the 2 third grade classes we looked at was because one class just had a Valentine's Day party and they were hyped up on sugar right before we walked in to give them an assessment, or some other random something that happened, some variable that we don't know about and that we can't control. So to say that we've found something or we've found support for the alternative hypothesis or theory, there needs to be replication. We need to be able to redo it. So another exercise, pause the video in a second, right? After you write down 2 generalizations that you've observed about people's behavior. So 2 examples that I have: if you stand too close to people, that's a typo. I know that that's the wrong 2. So you're secretly judging me in your heart, but I see that now, and that is incorrect. If you stand TOO close to people, they back up. Students who study more do better on exams. So pause the video, and then write down 2 generalizations that you know to be true or that you've observed about people's behavior. Okay, you unpause the video. Tell me if it's a descriptive or a cause effect observation. Those are the 2 types of generalizations. So descriptive just describes what's seen, no predictions. So I stand close to people and they back up. I'm not telling you why, I'm not telling you how, I'm not predicting anything, I'm just saying it happens. And then a cause and effect does make predictions about the relationships between 2 or more things. Like, if you study more, you will get a better grade on your exam. So going through the scientific method, right? We've got our observations, this theory. We're or these things that we've seen. Now we're going to develop a theory or a hypothesis based on that. So we have to identify the variables in our observations and then an explanation for that, right? I think that this is happening because, and think about how those variables are related to each other, and then go look at past research. If you learn anything from my class, hopefully you learned that you're not reinventing the wheel. You're not just going to be sitting there watching Criminal Minds one night and be like, oh my goodness, I've come up with this groundbreaking theory that no one's ever even thought about or come close to or developed ever. I'm not saying that you're not brilliant, and I'm not saying that you're not going to add something into the field of psychology or a science. But what I am saying is that there is past research. So we like to say that our entire field moves forward 1 inch at a time, right? We're always looking back at past research, seeing what's been done, seeing what's out there, and then saying, based on all of this research, I think if we change this little piece of the experiment or this little piece of the therapy or the treatment or this little part, then we might see these different results. So go look at past research, established sources, authority figures, peer-reviewed articles, even your textbooks, right? Go look at that. And then you can say, here's my theory, and here's how I think I can add to the literature. You're not even going to get your IRB approved if you cannot support why you're doing what you're doing with a bunch of past research. Step 3, testability. It has to be testable, right? If you can't test whatever you're saying, then what's the point of saying it? If we can't test it and say this is observable and it's defined and we can really work with that and then see if it made a difference, then you don't really have a theory that we can test, and it's not science at that point, right? It's just your opinion. And then falsification. That's the heart of the scientific method, right? We're not trying to prove our theory. We're trying to disprove the theory. And then when there's no disproving that can happen or has happened, then we say, maybe there's support there. Determinism. So that's another way we can use the scientific method. That's the assumption that a phenomena has an identifiable cause, right? We want to describe the behavior and then identify those behaviors related to it and then test specific causes or changes. If we did this behavior change? Parsimony is the idea, is this, big complicated sounding word that really just says simple explanations are more likely to be correct. So the more basic your theory, the better it is. The easier it is to develop a study so that we could falsify it, the easier it is to test it. And so it's this idea that you need to start with the simplest explanation first, and we can work our way past that, but start with the easiest, most testable, simple concept first. We kind of talked about both of those, but something in testability that I want to talk about is confirmation bias. So the reason that we look for support opposite to what we're looking for or wanting to be true secretly in our heart, right, is because of confirmation bias. Because if we ignore this evidence to the contrary, right, again, we're just kind of trying to prove our opinion. We're not really doing science at that point. So to avoid confirmation bias and to minimize that, that's why we have studies that have to be testable, and we find support for the null hypothesis. So you want to design a study that could give you a result that's inconsistent with the explanations, right? You should design a study that will probably tell you what you don't want to hear, as you're secretly trying to make this groundbreaking improvement in whatever field you're in. You need to design it so that it probably wouldn't happen, so that if it does, you're like, oh my gosh, there might actually be support for my theory, but you weren't setting out to prove it, because you could try to prove and explain away whatever you wanted. For example, that's why we don't talk about Freud that much anymore. I mean, in History of Psych or Gen Psych, sure, but no one's using psychoanalytic theory and interpreting dreams on a couch really anymore, right? His influence waned, even though we used him for decades, because people realized, well, we can't really test what he's saying. It's not replicable. We can't replicate it and we can't test it. And so really they were just his opinions. And he could explain away anything. If you asked him about it, he could explain, well, that was because, insert Freud's opinion here. But it was not real science. Sorry, Freud. So the goal of Basic versus applied research. That's what your book talks about next. The goal of basic research is to understand the fundamental process, right? And so your book gives an example of a study of insomnia versus anxiety. It's Morphy et al. 2017. And so I just looked that up on Google Scholar, and you can get the whole PDF for free on Google Scholar and look at it. And so pop quiz, is that basic or applied research? Assuming that you went to it and you found it, you looked up the study and you read the peer-reviewed article, you would say basic research, because they're just kind of talking about these fundamental processes, right? They're defining anxiety and insomnia, and they're talking about the correlation between the two, but they're not saying what we should do about it. They're not saying how to fix one of them. But the goal of applied research is to answer questions and solve real world problems. So you could take that basic article and this research that you've done and say, well, based on this peer-reviewed article and all this research and what they found, there's this huge correlation between anxiety and insomnia. I'm going to do this applied research where I look at college students and their sleep patterns and then how those change when it's midterms or final exams, right? And if we know there's more anxiety during those times, here's this intervention that I want to try. Maybe it's a certain, I'm making this up, but a certain habit that you do at night. So maybe you have people practice mindfulness in the evenings and turn off all their screens 2 hours before bed, or whatever method that you want to try. You're trying to answer this real world problem and give college students less anxiety. And so you're trying to work on ways to, if you can help the insomnia, then you think you can help the anxiety. And so you have this causal relationship that you're trying to actually do an intervention for now. That would be applied research. Sometimes application isn't obvious when it starts. Maybe you start your project and you're not exactly sure how it'll be applicable, but that comes along the way. And then external validity is really important because that's the degree to which research can be applied to a real life situation. So just because you found something true in the lab and you did that intervention with your college students, if then you go out and you give this intervention to real college students and you offer it on your campus, but it doesn't actually help real college students in real life, then it didn't have external validity. Applied studies help researchers refine their theories because what sounds good in theory maybe didn't work in real life. And so by making an applied study or doing applied research, they can keep refining it and refining it until hopefully they find something that does work. And then something to know is that research doesn't always fit neatly into the basic or the applied category. Sometimes it's really squishy and you're not exactly sure where yours will end up, or you think that it's applied and you get into it and then you realize, I just found correlations and I'm not contributing anything to the overall like methodology, or I'm not contributing anything that could show results. I'm just explaining and showing these correlations. So maybe it ended up being basic, but you thought it might be applied. And so if you do go look at the article, look up the Morphy et al. 2007 article, then you could guess if it's basic or applied, even though I totally gave you the answer to that. What are the results? Are those based off correlations? How strong are those correlations? Could this be turned into applied research? And if you turned it into applied research, to see if you could reduce anxiety, to see if that reduces insomnia, or vice versa, you could pick it the other way. You could say, which variables would you examine? How would you measure those? Can you systematically manipulate one of those variables? And then which ones would you need to control versus the ones you're manipulating? And then where or from whom would you get this data? What population or subgroup of the population? That's not for grades. That's just if you actually really want to think about this information and apply it to something in your textbook. But I think that's it. So let me stop my screen share, come back to you. Okay, so that's chapter 1 in a nutshell. What is research, scientific method, canons of research, basic versus applied, and empiricism versus determinism. So watch that, take quiz 1. Well, the quiz on section 1, right? The first quiz is just that stats review. But after you've taken the stats review, this is your first content quiz. So I hope that helps. And let me know if you have any questions. Bye, class.